One of the foundational myths of Jack Spicer's reputation as a poet and activist, or at least a cantankerous rebel, is his refusal in fall of 1950, while a grad student and teaching assistant at Berkeley, to sign the University of California loyalty oath. The oath read in part that the signee, quote, is not a member of the Communist Party or any other organization which advocates the overthrow of the government by force or violence. Renaissance scholar and Berkeley professor Ernst Kantorowicz, most famously author of the treatise The King's Two Bodies, was prominent among non-signees. Kantorowicz, a brilliant thinker and magnetic personality, has long been credited with inspiring the Berkeley Renaissance poets in their concept of poetry as a magic circle. Indeed, as Robert Duncan writes, it is not incidental that Spicer and Blazer first, and then in 1948, I were all involved in Renaissance studies with Kantorowicz, who had in turn in his youth been a central figure as an historian in the circle that gathered about the poet Stefan Gior in that curious reinstitution of a Medici Academy in the environment of symbolist poetry. So yes, in fact, Kantorowicz had been part of the so-called Georgikreis in around Stefan Georg in Germany. As I've written elsewhere, Professor Arthur Brodeur, who taught Old English to Spicer and Blazer at Berkeley, was just as, if not more, instrumental in shaping Spicer's poetics and politics during his student years. A Harvard-trained philologist, Brodeur published a translation of the Prose Edda in 1916, and his 1960 book, The Art of Beowulf, reflects many of the concepts he transmitted to Spicer during his studies at Berkeley. Dan, I think, will talk a lot more about that. Moreover, Brodeur, unlike Kantorowicz, was noted for his progressive political stance. In 1949, Brodeur offered a statement strongly objecting to the loyalty oath, calling it a dangerous attempt at thought control. Although Kantorowicz also wrote a statement objecting to the oath, he prefaced it with a disclaimer, I am not and have never been a communist. I am genuinely conservative and never have been taken for anything else. And he goes on to write a letter to Berkeley President Robert Sproul talking about how he'd actually fought the communists in Germany. Brodeur, meanwhile, seemingly had been a member of a faculty communist group at Berkeley that also included Robert Oppenheimer. It is worth noting here the diverging fates of Kantorowicz, Brodeur, and Spicer. Kantorowicz, stridently non-communist and enjoying the height of his power as a mid-career academic, leveraged his position to devise an escape to Princeton. Confusingly, Brodeur is listed among the non-signers of the oath by Berkeley's commemorative site. However, he actually did sign the oath under protest, perhaps handicapped by his advanced age and participation in communist activities. He stayed on and eventually retired in 1955. Spicer, of course, had no leverage whatsoever and left Berkeley to adjunct at the University of Minnesota. He returned in 1952, signed a modified oath, and continued his studies in Old Norse and Anglo-Saxon with Brodeur, but he never finished his PhD. All this provides fascinating history, but what, if anything, can it tell us about Spicer's poetics in relation to academia? Spicer's dramatic break with Berkeley, combined with the frequent screeds against the English department sprinkled throughout his mature poetry, seem to indicate a wholesale rejection of academia and contribute to a radical or romantic vision of Spicer as a sort of repentant to his nascent and aborted pursuit of higher education. A defrocked priest who rightfully abandoned a system that had abandoned him for the purer and less remunerative system of poetry. I propose instead that Spicer never left the English department, or perhaps, to put it more accurately, the English department never left him. Like the spooks, ghosts, and Martians that populate his poems, the English department is a talisman of power that Spicer persistently calls into play, desiring its rigor, hierarchies, and sense of literary history, even as he fears and mocks these qualities. In short, Spicer pursues what I would characterize as engaged marginality with regards to the English department. And I'm thinking here too of if you're on social media and you have any medievalist friends, you see constantly you're seeing these illuminations from the margins of medieval manuscripts where monks are sort of playing around with the text and maybe arguing with it and countering it in some ways. That's how I sort of perceive Spicer's attitude towards the English department, really. and the relationship that he wants. It's deeper, more complicated and troubled than simply having absorbed and knowledge and learning for the Martians to use as furniture in the process of poetic dictation, as Spicer describes in his lectures. Rather, the English department is an entity that Spicer works to keep attached to, albeit not too closely, bantering and arguing from a self-imposed position in the margins. We see this engaged marginality quite literally in the case of one of Spicer's academic papers. And this is the handout that Rich has given you. The paper is exhaustively titled, quote, "A preliminary excursion into comparison of Shakespeare's and Dryden's Troilus and Cressida in a chaotic attempt to discover neoclassical poetic technique, or some little truth found too early." The title already signals a great deal of Spicer's ambivalent, playful, and rebellious attitude toward literary studies. It sounds like a spoof. Perhaps Spicer is already satirizing the overly wordy and jargon-filled new critical approach he would later rail against in his lectures. The argument of the paper reveals Spicer moving beyond new criticism into a sort of proto-new historicism as he tracks word meanings in relation to Shakespeare's and Dryden's respective social realities, and, as I argue elsewhere, anticipates his mature concept of poetic correspondences across time and space, as he articulates in After Lorca. And the argument spills into the marginal comments, which vividly depict a friendly but grumpy back and forth with Spicer's instructor. In the first exchange, the instructor suggests, I'm not sure if you have this one, a brief paragraph. Do you have any more of these, Rich, so I can see what we're looking at?
Should be stacked.
Oh, do you need one?
Here. Okay. Just want to make sure I'm on the same page. Yeah, no, you don't have this one, but at the bottom of the page, the instructor has written, "A brief paragraph on poetic truth and plot and character would not be amiss." Spicer responds dryly, "A brief PhD thesis, perhaps." At the bottom of the page, the instructor writes, "Are you holding out on your generalizations?" I think that's what he wrote. "You're damn right," Spicer scrawls. "This is only the first paper." These cocky pronouncements offer an intriguing glimpse of the young scholar's ambition, already hinting at a PhD thesis and further research. And I should note here that I don't know when or at what point in Spicer's studies he wrote this. He did his undergrad, MA, and PhD work at Berkeley. I think it was his MA. And I think you can tell by the tone that he's probably not an undergrad, but he's also, I think PhD students are too dumb and too smart at the same time to write this kind of stuff. So I'm thinking it's an MA. In the second example, the instructor's remark is prompted by Spicer's drawing attention to the contrast between Dryden's serious first scene and Shakespeare's ambiguously comic opening. And this one you do have. The instructor writes, "Though this is one sort of beginning for Shakespeare's tragedies," seeming to push back against Spicer's use of terms like characteristic. Spicer huffily responds, "As Shakespeare's Troilus and Cressida is sui generis in relation to tragedy comedy, I fail to see the relation of Shakespeare's other plays here." The next example shows Spicer developing a sophisticated idea about the difference between Shakespeare's and Dryden's distinct concepts of power. And this is the next page. Instructor, note that Dryden often likes power. Rather, I think he's trying to explain Shakespeare's power here, not in an orderly kind. Spicer, Shakespeare's power is here power in the obsolete Renaissance sense. For the way that it is corrupted from constructive to destructive force, see the omitted lines of passage. Dryden means only human power corrupted. Dryden's observation here is psychological, Shakespeare's cosmological. Instructor, good. Not only does this exchange reveal Spicer and his instructor tussling over the material as intellectual equals of a sort, but also shows that Spicer is not just talking to himself. This apparently was passed back and forth between them. Skipping ahead, we find Spicer growing even more confident, but also playfully irreverent when it comes to his academic poetic wheelhouse, the topic of language. I think this is, yeah. the second one ahead, which you have to turn sideways. We find in the paper, Spicer wishes to distinguish Shakespeare's metaphysical language from a business speech into which he claims Dryden translates the play. Beside the passage, the instructor writes, "Needs clear defining," and I can't make out the rest. Spicer writes, "Language and concept, including power, including more than just human relations, is what I mean," and receives another good in response. Further down the same page, the instructor seems to ask, and if you flip to the next page, you can see this. The instructor seems to ask, relation of power to power, and Spicer writes, "They both rhyme." The instructor appears to have circled both and scrawled a question mark, not getting Spicer's deadpan bit of humor here. He then adds, "Problem of metaphysical, or as you have added, meta-human usage?" It is this sort of eggheadish overthinking and not getting it that Spicer would later display such impatience with in his poetry. One final exchange, if you flip the page and turn it upside down, I think. In the paper, Spicer writes about Dryden's alteration of a tower in the play from Eastern to Western. Another kind of change of language, he writes, one that is fortunately infrequent. It has no purpose, dramatic or otherwise. I wonder, the instructor writes. I don't, Spicer responds. It's the kind of student you'd love to have, right? So how does this engaged marginality work in Spicer's poetry? I first turn to Song for Bird and Myself, which Spicer wrote right here in Boston. He was here for a few years, or 2 years really, probably about a year actually, working at the Boston Public Library. The poem begins, "I am dissatisfied with my poetry. I am dissatisfied with my sex life. I am dissatisfied with the angels I believe in. Neoclassical like bird, distrusting the reality of every note, half real, we blow the sentence pure and real, like chewing angels." Bird is, of course, Charlie Parker, who had died essentially of advanced alcoholism in March 1955. Spicer imagines a mutually sympathetic conversation with Bird and transitions to an anecdote about two actual birds that got into the rare book room, referring to the Boston Public Library where Spicer worked. I draw attention to the quasi-refrain, neoclassical like bird, which he repeats a few times. We recall the term neoclassical from the title of Spicer's essay on Shakespeare and Dryden. It's difficult to determine precisely what Spicer means by it. The neoclassical period, or Augustan age in English literature, covers the first half of the 18th century, would have roughly included Dryden, Pope, Swift. It was an age marked not only by a return to the study and translation of classics, but of sharp satire and political writing as well. And I suspect that in Spicer's conception, it signals a learned but cantankerous and retro approach to artistic making. For the practitioners of the soft line, neoclassical, the poem continues, the soft line strains not to be neoclassical. And for the practitioners of the soft line, we might imagine those new romantics, the Beats, or the New York School poets like Frank O'Hara, whom Spicer had met and really hated, not got along with in New York. During the poem's interlude in the rare book room, Spicer mentions two female librarians who attempt to save the birds, Miss Swift and Miss Munsterberg, the latter of whom, the poem notes, was the first American translator of Rilke. This distinction would have meant a great deal to Spicer. Of course, Rilke's Duino elegies had inspired one of his first great serial poems, the Imaginary Elegies, dating from the Berkeley Renaissance period of the late 40s. The librarian's full name was Marguerite Munsterberg, who in 1917 had published a volume titled A Harvest of German Verse. This impressive 250-page anthology gathered translations of German language poetry, all done by her, dating from the 12th through the 20th centuries, and including selections from Martin Luther, ballads of folk and folk songs from the medieval period, Goethe, Heine, Stefan Georg, Hofmannsthal, and many others, in addition to Rilke. The poem reports Miss Munsterberg sang of the birds who end up being killed by a team of custodians Suppose one of them had been the Holy Ghost. A really Rilkean thing to say, I think. The poem returns to a contemplation of Charlie Parker, but it also returns to this remark from Miss Munsterberg near the very end. Quote, "This is the wonderful world of Dixieland. Deny the bloody motherfucking Holy Ghost." This is the end of the poem. You can start laughing, you bastards. This is the end of the poem. As Spicer explicitly identifies himself with Parker and the birds and the angels who die outside your window in the poem, he implicitly identifies with Ms. Munsterberg. The librarian is marginal and intellectual, sensitive and insightful. They're caretakers of rare books, but outside the academy. And while Spicer aspires to a pure and real creativity such as he sees in Bird, he grounds himself in the sensitivity and critical insight of the intellectual, the translator. In other words, his poetry everywhere evinces a desire for both realms, even as it enacts the tension between them. That tension is near the breaking point in Dover Beach, a long poem that opens 1961's Lament for the Makers. Chock full of literary allusions, the poem seems in deep conflict with its roll call of other poets. These include Matthew Arnold, author of the namesake poem, William Dunbar, of course, Alexander Pope, Robert Duncan, Wordsworth, Ezra Pound, and even Homer. But by allusion, also Dante, O anima cortese mantovana, comes from which is in the poem, comes from the second canto of the Inferno, and Robert Browning by way of Ezra Pound. The line, "Damn it all, Robert Duncan, there is only one bordello," paraphrases the opening of Pound's Canto 2, which is, what is it again? "Hang it all, Robert Browning, there can be only one Sardello." Another allusion lurking in the opening lines is the politically outspoken 16th century poet and playwright John Haywood. Quote, "Spider, fly, and the web are one for one moment." Spicer had written an academic essay on Haywood's 1556 poem, The Spider and the Fly, a handwritten draft of which resides in his archive. Having named a number of poets, Spicer writes words, worth, nods, he heap good, great poet, English department in his skull. Duncan writes about the name-checked and alluded to poets in Spicer's Dover Beach in an unpublished preface to a proposed Spicer bibliography, which is not surprising why it was never published, because Duncan spends half his time attacking Spicer. It's also housed in UB's archive. Quote, "Wordsworth, Browning, Pound, Duncan. They are all so close to Spicer's own naming of his kin that it may be that Spicer is the missing term here. Big Chief, he heap good, with English department in his skull." Duncan adds, it is, we realize, the author of the poem we are reading who can't get the English department out of his skull. And I believe Duncan's right about this, but he doesn't quite go far enough. There's a subtle but clear economy at work in Dover Beach with regards to poetic predecessors. The key to parsing the economy is the figure of Pope, whose name Spicer puns with pop, as well as Pope, as in the Catholic Church, and even uses to work in an allusion to Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. Pope, Pope, Pope of the evening, beautiful Pope. The neoclassical Pope is seemingly a hinge between the overly bookish and literary English department and a more folk-based popular understanding of poetry. To build on Duncan's insight, Spicer, the author, not only cannot, but does not really want to get the English department out of his head. Pope is pop in his best light, shading towards the language games of Carroll. But the poem also seems to admonish Pope for not being bookish enough. O anima cortese, Spicer writes, as Pope would have written if he had cared or had known Italian. The code switching between languages and literary registers is something the poem and Spicer needs. The Spider and the Fly can refer to the 16th century poem by John Haywood, but it can also allude to the 19th century children's verse by Mary Howard that Carroll parodied in Alice in Wonderland. One final example underscores this point. Intermission 1 from Language, composed 1963 to 1965, one of Spicer's first final published books. The poem begins with lines from John Donne's Valediction for Forbidding Mourning, which Spicer quotes inaccurately. Spicer has the lines, "The movement of the earth brings harms and fears," and continues, "Rhyme soothes." And in a book I read in college 15 years ago, it said that this was an attack on the Copernican theory, and a spidery hand had penciled in the margin, "earthquake." Daniel Katz writes of this poem, "Earthquakes, penciled into a book Spicer would have withdrawn from the UC Berkeley Library, localizes Donne and makes him a poet of California and the Pacific Rim, an unsettled place of shock and violence. This literally marginal reading reinstates Donne as a poet of crisis and disturbance." Building on this insight, I believe the marginality called into play by the spidery hand can also be read as less literal and more literary than this. Considering the quality of Spicer's own handwriting and penchant for arguing in the margins, the spidery hand could even be his own. Earthquake could be, as Katz argues, a way to bring Donne's poem in correspondence with Spicer's California reality, but it could also be simple folk logic, an engaged marginality that argues with an overly intellectualized English department reading of a poem, getting it in a way the English department does not. Yet Spicer needs the English department, a sort of straight man to his perpetual class clown, providing him a rich body of work with which he can argue and crack wise from the margins. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.